Perfect. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend our webinar today. This webinar is being sponsored by Access and put on in partnership between WICHE and Advocates for Human Potential. And today we are blessed to have Pat Tucker, who is a national expert on permanent supportive housing, here to present to you on the basic and fundamentals of permanent supportive housing. Questions we don't have time to do questions during today's presentation, but there is a link in the chat box already to a survey link. There's a link to this survey where you can pose as many questions as you want on any evidence-based practice. The questions are completely anonymous. The only personal information that we gather from you is your role and what region in Arizona you happen to live or practice in, and that's it. So feel free to ask as many questions as you want. There is a second follow-up session to this specific to permanent supportive housing, and that session is on April 20th. And there's also a link to the registration for that session in the chat box, and I'll put it there again towards the end of the session today. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Pat, and thank you so much, Pat, for taking the time to present to us today.
Oh, not a problem. I'm glad to be here. Hi, good morning, everybody. I just wanted to make sure that you do ask all the questions that you have. I've started permanent supportive housing programs, and I know quite a bit about starting them, keeping them going, and then making sure that you're doing it the right way. So today we're gonna, I love the colors, and I'm sorry, I was getting a little carried away because Arizona is one of my favorite states. So we're gonna talk about the overview of the principles and foundations of permanent supportive housing. This is going to be for new staff or to refresh experienced staff. And again, just because we don't want you to miss the opportunity to ask your questions, there's another link to the survey. So we're going to jump into what is permanent supportive housing? Well, it's housing that is affordable to someone who is on SSI. Either through rental assistance or housing development. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but it doesn't always have to be for someone on SSI. The key thing is to make sure that the housing is affordable, or that there is at least one affordable option. The other part of permanent supportive housing that is just as important is providing those wraparound services and supports to help people maintain their housing. So it's one thing to get people moved in. Sometimes that could be the easier part. The harder part sometimes is keeping people in the housing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So why are we doing this? And I always have to do a little bit about this because it matters whether or not you have stable housing. A lot of people do a lot better when they know where they're going to sleep at tonight. We found that stable housing helps people improve other parts of their lives, like start to deal with their mental health issue that they haven't dealt with. Because now that they have housing, at some point they might want to deal with mental health issues, or they might want to deal with the substance abuse issues. So housing is the beginning to helping people to get back on their feet. It takes a little while, so it's not an overnight process. You move people in, but they're not gonna be ready to deal with mental health the next day. It's a process. And we've seen people who have been in stable housing have improvement in areas of their physical health, their mental health. They have reduced hospital stays, and it reduces healthcare costs because people can, hopefully when we get them into housing, we can also get them set up with a doctor who they can see, and they can start to do some preventive health as opposed to just visiting the emergency room for everything. So what is it? It's got to be decent, safe, and affordable. It's community-based housing that provides rights, of tenancy, and it has to be under state, local landlord tenant laws because you have a lease. And you have to have voluntary, flexible support and services, and it has to be designed to meet the person's needs and preferences. Sounds easy, right? No, it's not easy, but it's doable. Um, the philosophy around the permanent supportive housing is that it's really for people with serious mental illness and other disabilities. So I know a lot of times when we do housing, sometimes working with the really hard to serve people seems overwhelming, but that's what this is for. It's for people who have severe issues. And we need to make sure we give them the same rights and opportunities as everybody else gets. So this is about, it's not about treating them any differently. It's about listening to them, finding out what they want, and making sure we find a way to try to get them what they want within reason. I mean, if you are homeless and you come in and you want a 5 bedroom, that's not going to happen if you're a single person. So it's all within reason. So here are the elements, and these are all of the elements of permanent supportive housing. It has to be integrated. So what does that mean? That means that we don't want to put everybody into a building in a community and have that building be the target. Like that's where all the people who were homeless and have mental health issues and substance abuse issues live. We don't want that. We has to be safe, decent, and affordable. It also has to be housing first, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. We also have to give people choice, making sure that people have a choice of where they want to live. It also has to be, permanent. And the permanent part, I think people get a little confused because permanent, it sounds like forever. And in this situation, we're not talking about forever. When we say permanent, we're talking about people need to have a lease in their name. So that gives them permanency of their apartment as long as they follow the rules of the building. And that's what we mean by permanent here. It also has to separate the housing from the services. And that becomes really crucial when you, as the provider, are also providing the housing. So some of you might already have housing that you are looking at. And in that case, you're going to need to make sure that we keep the services separate from the housing or from the property manager. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And you have to give them those tailored supports and services. This is not a one size fits all because we know that one size does not fit all. I can attest to that. So we need to treat every person individually. There are different types of permanent supportive housing. There, you could have a single site. Like I know when I first started doing permanent supportive housing, we had large buildings. I had my smallest building was 66 units and my largest building was 207 units of housing. That's how we started off, and that's how this program wanted to do the single site part, which you might want to do. You could also do integrated, where you go out and you find private landlords and you work with the private landlords to do the housing. Also, some places do scattered site, and scattered site, it can be done where you're either getting units from private landlords or you get some type of subsidies and you go out and talk to landlords and you can do master leasing, which means that you would be leasing the apartment to the person, the member. Or it could be long-term set-asides. There are programs where the landlords have to set aside some units for people with disabilities. So it could be that as well. So I just wanted to give you a sense because not all permanent supportive housing looks the same. So I know all of you might be looking at different models. So it's just important to keep in mind what the models are. and they all have, pros and cons. Um, so, and we can talk about that. You can, if you have questions, I'll be happy to talk about that. So, choice is important in permanent supportive housing. It's one of the dimensions. And what choice means is that we need to give people the choice about who gets to live with them. They also need to have a choice in what type of housing it is and where it is. So when you're thinking about choice, it's important to not just think about what's available now. You want to think about the whole picture. And so when I'm talking about choice, I'm not saying you can either have this apartment over here or you can have this apartment over there. When I talk about choice, I'm talking about I'm going to put all of the options on the table, and I'm going to give the member the pros and cons, in my opinion, of each of those places, even if it's not available, because they may want to work toward that. Sometimes you see something and you think, oh, that could be a goal. Maybe my goal is one day to have my own home. It's not right now, but we can help people work towards those goals. And so we know, and this is based on research. We know that choice makes a difference, and I can't emphasize it enough. If people get to choose where they live and who they live with, it makes a big difference. Think about when you decided where you were going to live. You made a choice, and you made that choice based on a bunch of things. You might have been looking at schools. You might have been looking at public transportation if you don't drive. You might have been looking at where are the schools, or where's the distance from my work. And so all of those people make choices based on different things, and we need to find out what's important to that person. I once had a client who his only criteria for where he wanted to live was it had to be within on the bus route or walking distance from his pharmacy. That was what was important. He wanted to make sure he was taking his meds. So we had to find him an apartment that was in walking distance or on the bus line where he could just hop on one bus and get there. Um, and that was, if that made him feel comfortable. And who am I to judge? I'm not there to judge. I'm just there to listen to the person. And this is just a little bit more about choice. It just goes into how, it's gonna be tough to find the housing, but it's worth it. It's work. And sometimes we won't be able to give everybody that affordable option. I mean, because everybody might not qualify right away. So, but we try to put an option on the table that's affordable. So, it might be a wait list. And so what we do is if it's a wait list to get on the affordable housing, we can work with that person to say, okay, the wait list is at least a year long. What about if we find a place that you can move into until your name comes up on the wait list? So we can still give choice. It's just a matter of helping a person to understand what the options are. The other thing that we want to do is, and this is another dimension, it's the separation of housing and services. We want there to be separation between the property manager and the service provider. So, if your agency owns its own housing, this becomes a little bit trickier, because what we're saying is that there should be a property manager at the building that works on building issues, and the services function has to be separate. So this means that if you're the service provider, you should not be collecting rent, because that's a property management function, right? Only property managers get rent. So what we're saying is the service people have to stay in their lane and only provide services. You can help mediate with the landlord. You can help negotiate with the landlord. You can argue for your client with the landlord, but that's a separate function. If you're working with private landlords, this is an easier part to do because they're landlords and you're not going to be stepping on their toes. But it's important to keep that separation, and that's the way life works. My therapist doesn't I don't go and give her my rent. I give my rent to my landlord and I go see my therapist for therapy. Has to keep that separation. And so this is just going, it actually helps the service providers to know that, if there's a problem in the building, say your member says something, my lights are not working or my smoke detector is not, it's just beeping. We can still advocate with the landlords for getting in there and repairing things, but we should not be trying to go in and repair things. Hopefully that makes sense. Um, and so then we move into another dimension: decent, safe, and affordable. We want there to be at least one affordable option on the table. And that affordable option doesn't mean it has to be right now, because we know the market. We know that affordable housing isn't easy to find. So, but you still can find an option. It might be a wait list. And we can put people on wait lists and say, we'll do our best to try to find you housing, but right now the lists are closed. So we're going to have to do this in a two-tiered way. Um, and when we say affordable, we're talking about HUD affordability guidelines. HUD says that affordable housing should be 30% of your income. So for some people who have no income, 30% of your income is zero. And so, we may, if you have no income, our options are going to be to try to find you a place that you can stay without income, which is going to be difficult if there's nothing available. Other option is getting employment, working with your supported employment program. Some people may have to work if we can't get them on SSI or SSDI or some type of income. So you might have to really partner with your supported employment program. Um, and so the other part of decent, safe, and affordable is the safe. When we say safe, what we're talking about is that everything in an apartment works. So a lot of times, if it's subsidized housing, they come out and do inspections and they make sure that the apartment is safe. If you don't have a subsidy, you can still do a basic making sure that the apartment is safe. You go in, you check all of the items in the place. You check to make sure the refrigerator's working. The stove works. You turn on all of the knobs and make sure everything works. You turn on all the water, make sure it all comes out. Open and close windows, open and close doors. Check outlets, plug in something. You can have a lamp where you can have anything, plug in and make sure they work. Make sure the smoke detector works. We want our people, when we help them find housing, to be safe. Now, there are going to be limits to that, though. So if a person, say one of your clients chooses to live someplace that is not safe, because remember, choice was an option, right? Choice is important. So a client or a member could choose someplace that doesn't meet our safety standards. And I actually had one person do that, not just one, but one in particular. He chose a place that when I went in, I was just like, "Are you sure you want to live here?" And he was like, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, I'll be right back." I ran to my car. I threw my suitcase in my car. I threw everything in my car, came back into the apartment. The apartment had so many roaches. And he was determined that this was the place he wanted to move. Everything that was in me said no, but I looked at him and I had to remember this is his choice. And so I basically said, would you mind if I talk to the landlord to see if we can do something about the roaches? Everything else in the apartment worked. It just was bug infested. And so I talked to the property manager. He said he would do an extermination. They would bring in somebody to do that. But he was like, look, it's hard to get the roaches out of the building. So he did an extermination. The person moved in and actually did really well. And I found out later because we kept talking and he finally started trusting me enough to confide in me. And what I found out was that two of his people that he hung out with on when he was homeless lived in the same building. And they had all decided that they were going to support each other in their sobriety. And so his support system was in that building. He didn't want to tell me because he thought, but that later it made sense why he wanted to be there and why that was important to him. And he did well. He actually he did better and we ended up getting him housing, different type of housing and employment. And he went on to do some great things. When we talk about integration and rights of tenancy, integration means we want people to live in regular places in the neighborhood, in communities. We don't want to try to do too many buildings that everybody lives in. Um, it's hard when you have a building that it's all people with the same issues because what happens is the normal, you know, way a building works doesn't work the same. Everybody's sitting around with the same issues, and that's not healthy. So we want to have mixed buildings. That means you need to be careful when you're out there trying to find housing. You need to be careful and not just find a couple of landlords that you can work with and fill up their entire buildings with your clients. Because you've turned a regular building into basically a homogeneous building where only clients live. So you want to keep that in mind. Now there might be some times you can't avoid that. Because remember, choice trumps all of this. People can choose to live there. And we also one of the reasons why we want to encourage people to live in the community is because in a community you see people go to work. And so some people might feel that pressure of if all my neighbors are getting up going to work, maybe I can do that. Or you also want to be teaching people how to get their own natural supports. We do not want to work with people forever. And if we don't help them learn how to create natural supports, then we're the only support. And that's not good. So we really want to help people build those natural supports. Like when I have an issue in my place, say I lock myself out, I have a neighbor who has a key. I go over, I say, I locked myself out. Can I get that key again? Or if I need, say I have an emergency and I need somebody to watch my cat, I have somebody who I can count on to do that. So it's important to have those natural supports and to start working with people to build those. Um, and we want to make sure that everybody has a lease. A lease is important because a lease lets people know as long as you follow this legal document, you can continue to live in this housing. And so that's one of the key principles. People can say, I don't want your services anymore. And and they can still keep their housing as long as they follow the rules of that building. So we want that. We don't want people, if they say they don't want services, we just all of a sudden say, sorry, you got to move as well. So it's important to make sure that people know they're going to still have that place to live. Um, so some places they don't have a regular lease. We want regular leases, but if somebody wants to go into an Oxford house or some other type of housing, that's really has program rules, as long as that's what the person wants, we don't stop them. But it's about what they want. We don't try to put them all into housing with program rules. Okay. These are just some simple things that are in a lease. And when we're helping people find housing, we want to go over the lease with them so they know what the expectations are. And sometimes it's kind of hard to read this gook and understand what it's telling you. And trust me, I've been a landlord and I've had people come in and never read the lease. They look at the part about what is the rent and what's included in the rent, and then they sign. It's a legal document. You have to make sure you understand what's in that document that you sign. So it's our responsibility as the service providers to make sure people are looking at it and we explain it to them. I always go over, you can't just have somebody move in with you because people will move in other people. I always go over how you shouldn't have loud noises after 10 o'clock at night. That's time where you need to get quiet. And that's part of how I'm going to try to help this person keep this housing is by going over the expectations up front. Another dimension to housing is access to housing. Crucial. This is not just about you anymore. This is about the system that you set up. So in some systems, you are going to get referrals, right? And those referrals will come to you and say they need housing. One of the key things that people don't think about is your referrals need to know that people to get into your program, all anybody has to say is, I want housing. That's the only criteria. There are no other criterias to getting housing. So when people come and look at your program, they're not going to just be looking at you, they're going to be looking at who you get referrals from. And if your referral base is not sending you everybody who wants housing, if they're picking and choosing, that will affect your housing program. So it's important to educate who are the people who are providing referrals to you, whether that's internal or external, because that will be a part of your program. Um, we know that there's nothing that determines whether a person is prepared for housing. We have not found any readiness screen that says a person's ready for housing. So we just go with everybody's ready for housing. Um, and so, this is just going a little bit more information. The other thing is when access to housing, you need to make sure that the service providers don't have keys to the apartment. Services has no reason to be going into somebody's apartment without being invited in. So the only person that should have keys to a person's apartment is the person, whoever they gave keys to, and the landlord. So if you as the service provider needs to get into an apartment because you're worried about your client, you need to go through the landlord and let the landlord know that you're worried, you haven't heard from this person in a while, and you want to do a well-beingness check. And that's how you get into an apartment. You should not have keys and be going in to do your own wellness check. That gets you into trouble because you're going against fair housing. Your services, and I know I'm getting low on time, but we started a little late, so please just bear with me. You have to provide the individualized voluntary recovery focused services. And it's not about you doing, it's that ongoing shoulder to shoulder means you do together. So our job in this whole process is to help people become independent. How do we help them become independent? Sometimes we have to show them how to do it. Sometimes we get in there with them and we do it with them. Or we just we if sometimes we have people we can explain it to. And then we just keep working with them. Because if I go in and I do it with you shoulder by shoulder and we work together, the next time I want to see you doing it by yourself. I don't want to have to keep doing it because my job is to make you independent and not dependent on me. Some other things that really go in here, and I don't want to lose sight of them, is people can refuse services at any point they want to, or they can dictate how often they want services. But we also need to make sure when we're working with people that we're also talking about risk management and crisis planning. You don't wait until a crisis to do crisis planning. You do crisis planning when things are calm and you have a plan. So you work with that person and say, what are we going to do if things get bad? If you have to be hospitalized, what do you want me to do? And we have a plan before, because in the middle of an event, you're not going to be able to sit there and have a conversation with the person about what do they want you to do. So you do that up front. And you also make sure that people know that the services are voluntary. But you can help people to work with you because in this whole process, you should be establishing a trusting relationship. You should be looking at this person and looking at what they can do and knowing also where their weaknesses are. And then we need to make sure we target those strengths and help them feel successful in their housing, because that's going to go a long way with them being able to be on their own. And so again, this is just talking about the intensity of the services. People get to decide that. Um, and we also want to be focused on recovery. This is not just about providing services. We want people to recover their identities, recover who they are. We want them to get back on their feet and be able to make decisions, because then we can move on to helping others. So this is about getting people to that point of where they can be independent and start to be able to use their own resources to get what they need. And I this is what I have for you. I thank you. Please don't hesitate to ask questions, because if you don't have questions, I would be concerned, because there's a lot to be thinking about. And I can really help you get some clues about how to make your program successful, because I've done it. I've done several programs, large programs where I oversaw, where one of my programs, we had over 5,000 people enrolled because it was a huge program. So I've developed programs. I've worked every position in the program. So please ask questions when we get to that survey. And that's all I have for you today. And I thank everybody for being here. And I'm looking forward to our next session where I can answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, everybody. Please feel free to fill out the survey. I've put the link a couple of times into the chat box. I've also put a link into the chat box for registration for the next session, where you get to hear Pat answer all of your questions. So please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Pat.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.